Thank you so much, Laura. I just want to thank you and Kelly very much for your partnership. We couldn't have done this without you, so thank you so much. As Laura said, my name is Melanie D'Arrigo. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of Transition Town Port Washington and the Landmark Theater. We are thrilled to have you. And wow, are we going to have an evening tonight? We are so fortunate to have two powerhouse organizers from New York with us. First is Geovaira Hernández. She's an Afro-Latinx Bronx native working to dismantle white supremacy, colonialism, and environmental racism and classism. In fact, all subsequent forms of oppression by organizing people with lived experience, money, and policy. In her current role as lead coalition organizer with New York Renews, she is focused on furthering the coalition's CLCPA implementation and CCIA passage efforts, as well as deepening understanding of truly intersectional environmental justice work towards a just transition. Also joining us this evening is Ryan Madden. He's a climate activist and organizer, and he has experience working with civil society groups within the United Nations climate change conferences, nonprofits on community-based energy and efficiency programs, and grassroots organizations on renewable energy advocacy and climate legislative campaigns. He currently serves as the sustainability organizer for the Long Island Progressive Coalition, where he leads efforts for energy democracy and climate justice in New York State. Wow, are we lucky tonight? You're all in for a treat. I can't stress that enough. I've gotten to know Ryan and Gio over the last few weeks, and we're just so grateful to have you both with us. So thank you so much for being here. Before we dig into the program tonight, I'd love to start the evening with a land acknowledgement. So I'm going to ask you all to join me in this moment of reflection. It is with immense gratitude and appreciation that I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Matinacock people. For the context of tonight's conversation, it's important that we acknowledge the history of this land and our relationship to it. That we think about our ancestors' role in taking this land and how our society perpetuates a culture of land abuse and colonialism, and think about ways we may repair what has been destroyed. So I'm just going to ask us to all take a moment and sit with that. Okay, thank you everyone for joining me in that moment of reflection. So I'm very excited again to be here. And what I want to start by talking about this evening is kind of giving a broad overview of where we're at. You're here tonight to learn about green legislation. I often joke, it's GND, CLCPA, CCIA, what do all these initials mean, right? So let's start with kind of what that looks like. Likely you've all heard a mention at least of the Green New Deal, right? Which is currently a resolution designed to combat climate change, reduce inequality, and create a living wage jobs program. The sort of continuation of the Green New Deal is the Thrive Agenda, which you may have heard a lot about last week. There were tons of climate action surrounding this in the congressional offices all over Long Island, in large part thanks to the Long Island Progressive Coalition and New Yorker News. And so the Thrive Agenda essentially fleshes out the Green New Deal resolution, defining how we reduce inequality, building power for workers through unionization, and setting industry standards on global warming. So both the Thrive Agenda and the Green New Deal are federal legislation, but unfortunately at this time, Congress has not shown a strong willingness to come together to pass it. So while we wait on the federal government to come to consensus and really push for the change that we desperately need, not all states are waiting on them, right? And that's, again, in large part due to groups like New York Renews and here on Long Island, the Long Island Progressive Coalition. In 2019, New York passed landmark climate legislation, the Community Leadership and Community Protection Act, which essentially adopted the Green New Deal and Thrive Agenda for New York State, which is very exciting for us. It's exciting for climate activists, and it's exciting for social justice activists. So, what I want to really take a moment before I get into the questions with our panelists and just sort of set the stage for where we're at, right? We've had decades of inaction by politicians, decades, and we are in a dire state, right? We have only a handful of years left before there is irreparable damage to our planet. And, you know, I sometimes wonder why we don't have people ringing bells in the street or sounding alarms, because that's how serious of a situation we're in. So I'm just going to take a moment again, and you're going to hear me. I like to do this. I like to be a cheerleader. I'm going to thank people like Ryan and Geo for the wonderful work that they do on behalf of their organizations in pushing us in the right direction and fighting for all people. We're all very, very lucky and fortunate to have folks like you motivating us and educating us along. And I am very confident that tonight you all will feel just as inspired by Ryan and Geo as I do. So my first question is going to you, Geo. Can you tell us what the CLCPA is and why it's urgent that we enact it at this moment?
Yeah, thank you, Melanie, for inviting us, and welcome, and thank you everyone for being here. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge the land that I'm on. So I am right now in the South, what is known as the South Bronx, which belongs to the Wappinger, Muncie, Lenape land. And I usually reside in Buffalo, where I've lived in the last 8 years, which is Haudenosaunee land. And as Melanie introduced me, I'm Geovaira Hernández. I go by she, her. A lot of folks call me Geo, so feel free to refer to me as Geo in the chat or with any other questions along throughout the time together. So before we get into what the CLCPA is, it's really important for us to talk about how the CLCPA came about, right? And that wouldn't have been made possible without New York Renews, and really grateful to be working with and for a coalition as such. So following the 2014 historic People's Climate March in New York City, which is still to date the largest climate justice march in New York City, there was really a lot of momentum, right, of having hundreds of thousands of people join and being able to carry that through in a way that had deeper impact than just showing up in one day. And a lot of folks came from all throughout the state to that march in New York City. And so that started or embarked a road trip of sorts. Started with People's Climate Movement right here in New York City, as well as NEJA, New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, and Align, which currently are a couple of our steering committee members within New York Renews, alongside LIPC, which Ryan reps. And really, folks started taking on that road trip across New York State to understand the different needs when it relates to climate and environmental injustice, recognizing that not all the needs are similar across the state. As a person who's born and raised in the South Bronx and moving literally across the state to Buffalo, right near the border of Canada, I saw a lot of differences, and I also saw a lot of similarities. And so it's really important, and I'm glad that folks that came before me as the coalition started acknowledged that and really took time, intentional time to devote to that understanding and learning. And so from that came that road trip, and then came the creation of New York Renews as a coalition of groups. And it started growing from there, and it came around the Hermes principles of being inclusive and letting people speak for themselves and building just relationships with and among each other, and letting people speak for themselves in that way, right? To put forth climate legislation. How can we provide solutions, and how can we do that not only in the practice of how we relate to each other, but also in the way that we relate to regulation and governmental structures such as laws. And so that's how the CLCPA came about, or originally the CCPA, which was the Climate and Community Protection Act. What we passed was the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. To this day, it's still the most ambitious climate legislation in the whole country. And so that's needless to say that a lot of eyes have been and continue to be on New York State from other countries and federally, because we have that, we've set that benchmark, and people are looking at us to see how we're going to implement that. And essentially what the CLCPA does is that it protects our planet, it invests in marginalized communities, and sets renewable energy targets for New York State. It is a truly intersectional climate legislation that regards to climate, or acknowledges climate justice in a way that is so much more broad than just the air, than just water, than just food, but really takes a look at different factors within our environment. So the CLCPA states that New York must reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 85% and be completely carbon neutral by 2050. It also sets benchmarks for these goals to be met up until our scope and plan date, which is 2023, to be submitted. In terms of investing in marginalized community, the law states that 35% of benefits of clean energy and energy efficiency funding has to go to disadvantaged communities and frontline communities, meaning low-income communities and communities of color, specifically because we acknowledge and realize that a lot of the brunt of climate change and environmental racism and environmental classism has and will continue to hurt these frontline communities first and worst. As a person who was born and raised in the South Bronx and never learned about these issues, but was experiencing it from a really young age. And then it wasn't until I moved to Buffalo and years after being in Buffalo and started learning about these big systems and how they affected me and continue to affect me and people around us. It became so much more clear. So being able to put that in a law was really important and continues to be really important for us so that we invest and are able to provide reparations in some sort to the like immeasurable damage that you referred to, Melanie, right? We are at a point in place in time and in history that if we don't act boldly and we don't act now, we are not gonna be here, quite frankly. And so we really need to act boldly and we need to do it equitably, not just in the perspective of just a few, which is how this country has operated way too much since its creation as the United States of America. And then in terms of setting renewable energy targets across the state, under the CLCPA, 70% of our electricity must come from renewable energy sources by 2030. And by 2025, we must increase solar capacity by 250%. And by 2035, we must build enough offshore wind to power 6 million homes across the state. And then you must ask yourself, how are we gonna make this happen? This feels like a lot in a short period of time, especially given COVID and living within a pandemic and the fact that it's been over a year now that we've been living through a pandemic and how time is flying. So the CLCPA created a Climate Action Council, which is a state board of 22 people, including representatives from state agencies, relevant state agencies, people appointed by legislature and the governor, who are tasked with coming up with a plan to make New York State fossil fuel free by 2050, as what the CLCPA notes. Within that Climate Action Council, there's different working groups like the Just Transition Working Group, Climate Justice Working Group, and other advisory groups. And then the last thing I will say about the CLCPA is that we have until January 2023 to be able to create and put forth this scope and plan. And so the implementation of this bill is it's in the process right now. And so it's really important for us to really put pressure on those that are in the Climate Action Council, as well as the advisory panels and boards, to put forth a plan that doesn't undermine the justice and equity aspects of the CLCPA and doesn't put away or throw under the rug the different aspects of needs that are across New York State and in different communities because of the fact that this has never been done before. This is why people have been appointed to that board, and this is why we've made the impossible possible, because we need to be, again, taken action in such a bold way if we're really serious about being here in a couple of decades and about creating a future that is not only survivable, but sustainable and thrivable for our future generations. So I'll just leave it at that. I'm really excited to be here. A lot of information. So any questions, feel free to drop in the chat. And I know that we'll get into some more stuff. So appreciate you, Melanie, for posing that first question.
Thank you so much, Gio. I really appreciate that thorough response. My next question, I'm going to pose it to you, Ryan. As you know, I'm a member of Transition Town Port Washington and Sunrise Movement Nassau County, both of which support enacting the CLCPA and the work of New York Renews. Last week, Long Island Progressive Coalition and New York Renews, as well as One Indivisible, held a week of action urging New York State legislators to support the CCIA. I know you were a huge part of that. You were all over the place. We appreciate it. But which, the CCIA, for those that are listening, it's called the Climate and Community Investment Act. There we go, more initials, right? But I'm wondering, Ryan, can you tell us tonight a little bit more about the CCIA? Talk to us about how it's funded and why it's crucial that we pass this piece of the legislation this particular season.
Yeah, absolutely. So hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Madden. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the sustainability organizer with the Long Island Progressive Coalition. And because of COVID, I've been staying a little bit outside my normal area. So I'm currently in Vernon, New Jersey, which is the traditional land of the Ramapo Munsi people. So yeah, last week was an incredible week of action. I'm gonna drop a video from coverage from News 12 because it really kicked off with an event with Congressman Swazi around the Thrive Act that Melanie spoke about before, but continued on with multiple actions at Assembly Member Englebright and Senator Kaminsky's office in service of the Climate and Community Investment Act. As Melanie said, we're keeping our eye on the federal landscape because obviously we need statewide, regional, and global coordination around decarbonization and equity plans. But right now, New York State is really, still the standard bearer and leader. If folks heard some of the numbers floated around in Biden's, $2 trillion infrastructure plan and the 40% mandate, that comes from the OG Climate and Community Protection Act. Before some politics watered that down and inserted an unnecessary additional letter into the bill's name. So, I know that was a lot to digest around the full scope of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. There's a lot of moving pieces to it. It might be the first time folks are familiarizing themselves with it. So we understand that, this is the beginning of several conversations, right? Some of you have been, I see some friends on here, people who have been, in the trenches with us over the years to get this bill passed. But part of the implementation process, right, is actually funding this. Once we have set in place an understanding of, okay, we need X amount of kilowatts there, we need offshore wind here, we need battery storage here, here's what local towns and governments need to do, here's what business needs to do, is what is the actual funding mechanism for this? Because we're talking about tens of billions of dollars every year in order to achieve those goals. So what we have done at New Yorker News and in our membership organizations, like the Long Island Progressive Coalition, is help develop another very deeply thoughtful, intentional, and equity-centered funding plan called the Climate and Community Investment Act. And what that does, it puts a fee on corporate polluters emitting greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants to raise $15 billion every year in New York for dedicated spending on large-scale renewable energy, community-led transition programs, worker assurance programs, and of course some rebates, knowing that anytime you try to hit the bottom line of a for-profit institution, they're going to try to pass along some of those costs to consumers, but they're the ones that need to justify that and justify CEO salaries and management fees before asking why we need to bear that brunt. So again, it's really about like historical accountability. There's a small number of corporations and entities that are responsible for these emissions, and communities who have been most viscerally harmed by this that need to not only be made whole, but prioritized, centered, and properly resourced. So that's what we're pushing for this year. We have a version in the Senate right now with 21 co-sponsors. We just got the updated Assembly version today, 23, I lied. And we just got the Assembly version today. And so we're really excited to kind of kick off the legislative session to get this across the finish line as a crucial component of realizing our equity and emission goals codified just 2 years ago through CLCPA.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I appreciate that. All right, so for me, one of the most groundbreaking aspects of the CLCPA is the fact that it prioritizes frontline and marginalized communities who for decades have really borne the brunt of toxins and pollution and environmental catastrophe. So do you believe, and I'm going to pose this to Geo first, do you believe that the CLCPA and CCIA will truly have an impact on lifting inequality? And what kinds of local programs can we expect to see here on Long Island?
Yeah, thank you, Melanie, for that question. I truly believe that that's the case, right? That very aspect is in the DNA of both the CLCPA and the CCIA, and purposefully so. Again, to not only acknowledge, but also address the harms that have happened and will continue to happen to those frontline communities. As I mentioned, I was born and raised in the South Bronx, so I had no idea that what I was breathing in, what I was eating, all of that within my environment was literally killing me slowly but surely, right? And that is the case with a lot of communities across the state, some way more than others if you're within a frontline community, but at the end of the day, we're still being poisoned at the sake of corporate greed, wherever we are within the state, within the country, within the globe, right? And so that has been incorporated and addressed in the CLCPA and in the CCIA, to the point where Ryan mentioned that we're seeing some of the aspects of 40% investment in other pieces of legislation, both statewide and nationally now. And thinking through, like, when you think about your environment, it took me a while to understand this because, again, I didn't grow up in an educational system that was teaching me all the sets of how my environment, all the different issues and identities that my environment is a part of, right? And we purposefully don't live in a society that teaches us that, because then we'd understand how we're getting poisoned. So when you think about our environment, we have to think about where we grow, where we live, where we play, pray, all the things. It's not just this singular, again, water or food or air, but our environment is made up of those aspects, right? Of what our food systems is like, what our water system is like, what our energy system is like, transportation, education, our safety mechanisms in terms of policing, in terms of health, both mental health and physical health, housing, as well as economic justice. So all of these different aspects are a part of our environment. And so when we're making legislation that is environmentally just legislation, it has to be incorporative of that. We have to stop that divide and conquer mechanism of white supremacy and colonialism of just addressing one issue at a time, because that's not doing us any service, any good, and will further divide both our issues as well as the way that we address these issues, and will limit how much we can further work together for true intersectional solutions. And so acknowledging and reducing toxins as a part of our regular and normal life, especially in frontline communities, again, is part of the DNA of both of these bills. I think about all the different youth programs that are within the CCIA and all the different aspects within the CCIA, right? So when we got the CLCPA passed, we saw that there were some provisions that got nicked. And so we really committed to having a year-long process of revisions to the CCIA, both to make sure that the aspects that got taken out that were related to justice and equity were there and were much stronger than possible. So when we're talking about good green jobs, and at a rate of 150,000 good green jobs within the first decade, I think of so many people in frontline communities and in communities across the state that could be getting privileged wage jobs to create the future that we both deserve and that we need, right? That's union wage jobs. That's $50 an hour to be installing solar, to be reinstalling the infrastructure to our pipelines, all of the things that are a part of our environment, that we deserve those jobs, and that our youth can be seeing themselves as a part of that transition. So there's a youth program within the CCIA that can lead to apprenticeship programs for kids in high school, being able to learn about these infrastructures and how to then, right after high school and after 2 years of college and 4 years of college, be able to get that good green job. So that it's not just something that is obsolete, that is so far away, but something that they can feel and they can work towards and be excited about, right? Like I've talked to my own nephews and my little cousins, and they say how boring school is and how they would actually be excited to be in school, both virtually and in person, if it meant that they were working towards economic security and workforce development in a way that we're just not afforded to right now, especially in frontline communities. And then in terms, I'll leave the last point, and then I'll pass it off to Ryan, is that within both of these pieces of legislation, we acknowledge that climate justice is racial justice, it's economic justice, it's political justice. It's all of these different aspects, again, coming together intersectionally and intentionally so that they're not siloed anymore, because that is what true intersectional environmental justice legislation and policies and practices need to be doing, because we're not just one individual, one identity. We're so much more than that. So we need to treat our policies in that way. And because I'm not in Long Island and I don't live there, I want to make sure to pass it off to Ryan, because he is there and organizes there and does so much great work, to really get a sense of what this can mean and look like for folks on Long Island.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure if folks aren't familiar, we're really already being seen as a huge hub for offshore wind development. There's already 3 universities that are talking about job training programs and research and development, and there's literally going to be infrastructure built off in the megawatts off of the shores of Long Island. So we're talking about thousands and thousands of good union jobs that can get supercharged with the investments under the CCIA. So that's just one thing, and some of that is already in development, or some of that is already happening. There's great organizing among the unions over the course of years in order to ensure that the wind energy industry was going to be a union friendly place. But then we have like grassroots solar campaigns, like the one that the Long Island Progressive Coalition runs, where we explicitly work with nonprofits and houses of worship, and as of recently, affordable housing developments to ensure that these institutions who are traditionally left behind in the renewable energy economy have access to low-cost solar, and that we're thinking about creative, innovative ways around community solar or cooperative ownership, so that people collectively own things rather than, again, centralizing ownership in one person. And some of those priorities are reflected in a recent report that the Nature Conservancy on Long Island put out called the Long Island Solar Roadmap, which was this incredible 3-year effort with utility members and community organizations, environmental groups, renewable energy industry people that came up with this comprehensive roadmap for how to develop more solar than Long Island could ever possibly think of developing. So investments from the CCIA could go into that. And part of our orientation in this work too is not just switching out kilowatts, but shifting power dynamics within communities. So some of our priorities that we got into that document is around creating energy improvement districts, so that you actually have places that are dedicated to participatory planning around renewable energy developments, and prioritizes cooperative ownership over these assets. So these are all things that we can see in this roadmap. And I know there are probably questions related to the end. I see a question around geothermal that's not addressed in the solar roadmap, but that is deeply a part of CLCPA and CCIA, because we need to electrify all of our heating systems and make sure that that source of energy is clean, which geothermal is the way to go. And so the only other last thing I'd say is, a lot of my work over the years has been doing a lot of solidarity and support work with the various indigenous nations on Long Island. And there's some really incredible housing and energy programs that the Shinnecock Nation are trying to undertake. So, communicating with them about some of their needs, the CCIA could help, do retrofits for their entire building stock, help ensure community solar for the entirety of the community, and help with some coastal resiliency things as they're facing increased storms with climate change.
Thank you both so much. I think you're so right, and you both touched on this, but Gio, you so eloquently spoke about the intersectionality of this legislation, that it's not just a climate bill, it's not just a social justice bill, but it's a little bit of everything, right? And that's what's so incredible about it. You both also touched a little bit about the jobs component, right? And I wonder, Ryan, could you talk a little bit more about the impact of those jobs for the Long Island economy, where we talk about having a little bit for everybody, right? We know that's what people want. People want lower taxes and they want jobs, right? So I would love for you to touch upon what that could look like for us here on Long Island.
Yeah, as Gio mentioned, statewide, the figures in some of our economic analyses around job creation is that within the first 10 years with the Investment Act, that we would be creating 150,000 jobs. So the portion of that on Long Island looks like, upwards of 10, 20,000, potentially more in offshore wind, energy efficiency, solar, and geothermal. So we're talking about, depending on how the port infrastructure is built and how things are developing in other parts of the region, we're talking about manufacturing, we're talking about installation, we're talking about environmental, impacts assessments. We're talking about people going to homes and doing energy retrofits and building audits, people doing solar installations, electrical engineering, resiliency things for, underlining or putting undergrounding, sorry, all of our electric infrastructure so that it's more resilient and protected from increased storms. So we're talking about major job opportunities. And again, we already have a infrastructure through SUNY Farmingdale, SUNY Stony Brook, and Suffolk Community College that are already thinking about job training programs, apprenticeship programs, like train the trainer initiatives for offshore wind. So, and Long Island already leads in the state with the highest amount of residential solar installations. So we're only talking about more solar businesses being resourced with a pipeline of talent. So, we're really talking about an incredible amount of opportunities across the board in multiple sectors with different pathways for different skill sets.
That sounds really good for Long Island. That sounds good for New York too, right? I know we touched a little bit about clean energy sources, but I want to talk a little bit more in depth. So we know the CLCPA has a goal, I think Gio mentioned earlier, of reaching zero emissions by 2040 by reducing emissions by at least 85% below 1990 levels by 2050, right? And we also know that CO2 emissions from the burning of fossil fuels are equal to 93% of total human-caused CO2 emissions and 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. Yikes. Can you talk to us about how the CCIA will transition New York away from fossil fuels and this dirty burning to really these cleaner energy sources, and what can we expect in Long Island? And I guess I'll throw that to Ryan. You guys can tag team that one.
Sure. Yeah, so as we said before, right, we have our emissions and equity mandates in law with CLCPA. And we really see CCIA as the supercharging funding mechanism in order to make that transition and do so in a way, again, that is community and worker centered. So, not only, there's, I don't want to get into the politics of different pricing mechanisms, but there's different thoughts around how to institute fees on greenhouse gas emissions, and some see them as a market-based mechanism to reduce emissions. We really see this as a revenue generator, but it'll also incentivize actors to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So, Ryan,
if I could just interrupt you for 1 minute. We have participants of varying education levels. Can you talk a little bit about what emissions are for folks that may not know?
Sure. So that's funny. Yeah, so at the point source of whether it's a power plant or your car, when you turn on the engine, there's a combustion process in order to make the thing do the thing. And a product of that, when you use petroleum-based and fossil fuel-based things like oil and natural gas, are the outpour of carbon dioxide and methane emissions, which have properties at a molecular level that trap heat and exacerbate the natural greenhouse gas effect that our atmosphere has. But it also causes a lot of co-pollutants, which are the nitrous oxide, the sulfur oxide, that create respiratory disease and health illnesses and cancers in communities, which is a part of our polluter fee. Because again, it's not just about the harm done writ large to the climate, but it's the visceral, toll on people's lives and health and well-being. So not only does that help generate more revenue, it helps assure a deeper sense of equity for communities who, again, are host communities for these fossil fuel infrastructures, which, again, are predominantly low-income communities and communities of color. And so, yeah, I think, there's CCIA can be an accelerator. There's also nothing in CLCPAs that says that we can't go faster. There's a real need to do things quick here. And
do you think we should go faster? Should we be bolder, Ryan?
Yeah, we should have been bolder 50 years ago. So just a little bit of, terrifying grounding. So all of the impacts that we're seeing from climate change are from emissions 40 years ago. So every single day that we do not turn off the valve of fossil fuels, we lock ourselves into further devastation, sea level rise.
Say that one more time, Ryan. Say that one more time.
Every single day that we do not turn the valve off on fossil fuels, we lock in climate catastrophe and further devastation for communities, because there's a lag time in when emissions go and their heat trapping capacity. So yes, we need to be bolder, and that's why we need coordinated state, federal, and global action. And that's why New York is really well positioned to get it right here. We have the timelines that we have because that's what could be negotiated in the political climate, but there's no reason that like towns, municipalities, and other private actors couldn't accelerate that and do that on their own time, or help influence the push for other states, other regions, other federal actors to kind of like hit, in this case, I guess, an electric accelerator on the gas.
And that's sort of not unlike what New York is doing with this legislation, and hopefully acting as, a test case to push other states to do it, and then hopefully on a federal level. But I like what you said. We need to move quicker and we need to be bolder. So that's a good takeaway for all of our participants viewing tonight. My next question, I think I'm gonna direct this at Geo. Fossil fuel companies have long skirted CPA rules, right? And they have long taken advantage of their partnerships with politicians. The CCIA is unique in that it will force corporate polluters to finance the CLCPA. But a major problem with reform is that many corporate polluters donate large sums of money to their elected officials who make the laws. And because these polluters are big donors, they have, in many ways bought seats at the negotiating tables. And this has caused delays in implementing climate legislature, which I mentioned earlier, these decades of inaction. And it's also led to the rise of false green solutions. So my question, Geo, is how do we expose that? How do we fight against the billions of dollars being dumped into the political system to rig the laws against the public? And, I'll throw this last one out to either of you. Can you talk about what exactly false green solutions are and how we can really combat them as a public?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I feel like my first response is twofold and complementary to each other. So we're in 2021, right? And so our technology has deeply, deeply advanced. And I say that to say that we've seen mass increase of exposure to corruption in ways that we've never seen in decades before. We're able to see folks mapping out who's getting paid at the sake of our livelihoods. And so that's one really big and vivid way to show who's in support and who's not, who's getting paid off, again, at the sake of our livelihoods. And pairing that level of exposure with putting public pressure on legislators. So legislators and folks that are appointed are, again, appointed and voted into positions of power to represent communities across the state and to represent the people that live within their districts, right? And so if the case is that people are not, if these representatives and these legislators are not representing the needs of their constituents, then the process should and has to be exactly what got them there in the first place, getting people out to vote and vote them the hell out. So that we can actually put people that are concerned and are actually working for their communities in these positions to truly represent, right? And that's really representative of also what we did in 2019. In 2019, we saw Governor Cuomo say that, yes, he acknowledged that climate was the biggest issue of the era, but yet by the beginning of June, it hadn't made it into his top 10 policy priorities to pass that year, right? And so we organized such beautiful organized chaos that we put him on the spot in a way that he had no other way to respond than to agree to pass this historic legislation, right? And to plug back to Ryan and saying the senseless, adding a letter to the bill that we had come up with and put forth. Governor Cuomo had in that year put forth his Climate Leadership Act at the state of the state, and so being that level of petty of fine, you give me no other option but to pass something, and you've turned my words against me in a way that favors that of the people's climate legislation. I'm gonna make sure that I claim myself as a climate champion by putting an aspect of the bill that I put forth within this one that got put forth in the end. And so I just want to say that that's really important. We need to really be assessing who is representing us at what level, from the like really local to like city council to county to state to federal levels, because these people hold a lot of power. I was born and raised, again, not knowing about politics. I was very much a person that would say, like, I'm not involved with politics. What I was really saying that I didn't really understand was that I don't understand politics, because we're not taught to understand politics to the magnitude that it has power. Everything around us is political, from the corner of our street, from the sidewalk, if it's cracked or not, if it's not getting repaired, everything is personal. And so the political is personal. And if we're not taking that level of like personal intent and personal responsibility, and seeing that played out in the political sphere, then we're just letting this corporate greed continue to win at the sake of our lives and at the sake of corporate greed, right? And so we need to be voting those individuals that continue to show who they are, both in the way that they're accepting money from corporate and fossil fuel greed, as well as the way that they're not voting. And we need to show that people power, we need to choose people power over corporate greed. It's 2021, as Ryan said, we're experiencing the effects of 40 years ago, and we're going to continue to do that. And the same is for individuals, us as humans, as well as other species. There's a lag time for how and when we experience the effects of these emissions and co-pollutants, and that will continue to be the case. So if we don't do things that are super bold now and that feel impossible, then we're never going to get to where we need to be.
Thank you, Gio.
I'll let Ryan take the last piece of that question.
If you want to talk a little bit about the false green solutions, Ryan, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, plus to everything Gio shared. I have a much stronger critique of electoral politics that I will save for this conversation. You know, so some of the things, and this is why I sustain, like, because at the end of the day, what I fundamentally am uplifting in what Gio shared is that it's all about being organized. It's often, there's a phrase like organized money versus organized people. We're never going to have the concentration of wealth that fossil fuel CEOs, billionaires, and the politicians that they buy out have. So we need to be organized, and we need to be permanently organized. So we passed this monumental bill. We didn't go home because we knew, A, we had to be responsible for helping to shape the implementation of the bill, and that we needed to fight for this other legislative mechanism to ensure its equitable funding. So good thing that we're still here, because what we're seeing in the implementation process is fossil fuel interests are part of some of these decision-making bodies, and they are offering solutions like renewable natural gas, which is not a thing, offering you know, trying to keep open incineration, waste to energy, where you burn trash, which is not allowed under the law. They're trying to very ambiguously try to forward this notion of green hydrogen without explaining that, like, there's a process of hydrolysis where you split a hydrogen and oxygen atom, and it creates a source of energy, or you can use it for battery storage. But if you're not starting that process with renewable energy, then it's still dirty. And a lot of the ways that they're trying to do this is by still utilizing the existing infrastructure for natural gas pipelines, so that they can say, oh, we're going to keep building this pipeline because then we'll convert it down the line to this green hydrogen. So it's a way to perpetuate their, you know, their bottom line, their shareholder interest, and not actually make the commitment to transition away from an entirely new paradigm of energy management. So it requires permanently organized communities to push back against this stuff, to show up in these hearings, to offer alternative solutions, to, you know, create some noise in front of some of these CEOs' places of business or their homes, or having to shut down places of operation where they're trying to expand infrastructure that shouldn't be built. And you can only do that if you are in relationship with organized communities. You yourself are an organizer, you are relating to organizing practices, which, you know, feels daunting, right? Because it's like you have to be forever vigilant. But if you kind of view it as a way of just relating to the world in deep sense of community, it doesn't feel like work. And it feels like a responsibility, especially for someone in my position who benefits from these legacies of harm that we've discussed here. As someone who is a white man in this world, like, my life is pretty easy comparatively, and there's a sense of like being a part of these historic forces that you can like take ownership of shifting and changing. So it just feels really important to kind of like treat this as not something like political as or organizing as something outside of yourself, as something that some people do that I don't. Even again, another diatribe that we don't need to go down. Even the word activist is an interesting term because it makes it feel like it's something that someone else is doing, or it's a moniker to describe what people should be doing, when it should just be engaged communities organized under shared values that are trying to build a world that is just, equitable, participatory, which again, this is hard, right? Like people are people and we're difficult and challenges emerge, but like the stakes are too high for us not to ask ourselves at every point in our day, what am I doing to solve X? How am I relating to this issue? What can I do about that? Who's working on that already? And how can I just show up and be supportive? There's so many incredible things going on in so many sectors of people's community. I mean, like Transition Town Port Washington and the incredible work that they're doing, and Melanie's work. Like there's just so many different pockets of things to involve yourself with that you also don't need to recreate the wheel. So I'll stop there after.
Thank you. And it brings to mind what Gio mentioned earlier, that sort of everything is political, and you say like this word activist, like I think everybody is an activist, right? Because everyone should be an engaged community member. So thank you for that. I think I'm just gonna ask one more question because it's the one that I think is very, very important. We've digested a lot of great information tonight. I'm so thankful for both of you for coming here and educating us. But, we talk about climate change and climate catastrophe like it's this thing over here, right? And we sort of feel passionately we want to help, but we don't always really fully grasp, I think, what that actually means. So what I'd like to talk about, and maybe Gio, you might be a good person to ask this first, right? Like, what does our world look like if we do not act, right? And not just from a climate perspective, but let's talk about what does it do to women all over the globe? What does it do to migration patterns? Because you mentioned earlier how this is so intersectional, and it's something that I think about all the time. It's not just a climate issue, it's going to affect all of us, right? We know that environmental catastrophe displaces poor women more than anyone else, right? So I wonder, like, if you could just, and I know we only have a few minutes, so I'm sorry, then we're gonna do some actions, everybody. We're gonna open it up to questions. So if you guys could just sort of limit it to maybe like I know like it's not a lot, but like maybe like a minute and a half each so we can open it up.
Yeah, that feels so hard, Melanie. So I'm gonna try my best. So really thinking about, again, we're experiencing a lot of the catastrophes as it is. In the last 2 to 3 years, we've experienced more climate catastrophes than in decades before, and that's going to continue to happen because, as Ryan said, we're experiencing the harms of 40 years ago and how that's happening now. And the truth of the matter is that Mother Earth is trying to protect herself, as would any of us. When there's any harm, our bodies are naturally trying to protect and heal from that harm. And so we're seeing Mother Earth do that, but the harms that humans continue to cause is in ways irreparable, and so calls for that bold climate action. I think as women, and as a woman myself, seeing that we are life givers, and the fact that climate change is exacerbating both fertility issues, deformities because of climate change effects, the issues and the impacts are so endless, to how we're able to give life and how we're able to carry life and give life and sustain life thereafter, right? Again, all of these issues are entwined within our environment. So all of the like different aspects of racial justice feel so much bigger, but are so part of our climate change and environmental injustice problems. Politics within the US have historically been governed by men, particularly white men. And so we've seen a surge, thank goodness, of more and more women taking political positions and pushing forth really bold solutions. I'm really grateful for that. We also have seen a youth taking over the world that they've inherited because they feel really quite shitty about the world that they've inherited and feeling that level of responsibility that they need to do something because our older generations fail to do something and also fail to recognize, because again, we're not taught how these aspects are going to harm us in the long term. And then I'll just end in 2 points, right? Like continued extraction and exploitation in countries outside of the US from the US cause migration patterns and cause folks to flee their own native land and native countries in hopes for a better world. That's the same thing with my own family. My family comes from the Dominican Republic and has been here since the late 80s in hopes of giving me and my brothers and my family members a better life, but still a struggle life because of the way that immigrants are treated and seen in this country, despite the fact that, as we know it, the US is made up of immigrants. So again, going back to that racial justice point. And I'll leave with the reflection. I remember back in 2016 and 2017, I traveled to Guatemala for the first time, and traveling through different cities of Guatemala and having met people and hearing the stories, because Guatemala has one of the most agriculturally diverse climates in the world. And so they provide a lot of the food and food systems that we have today. And I just remember hearing a daunting story from a farmer saying that before when he decided to move to New Mexico to provide a better life, to work for his family because he couldn't find sustainable work in his homeland, he worked in a restaurant and saw asparagus and honeydew melon for the first time. And that label said product of Guatemala. And he had no other like physical reaction than to like break down and cry, because the food that was being produced in his homeland, he had lived up to his 30s and 40s and had never seen that, because the food is not for him and for his people. It's rather extracted and exploited for others. And so we really need to take a look at that. Like climate change is so extractive, and that really brought me to an understanding of the US's impact to other global communities and other countries that we're not talking about enough, that we need to really be included in our climate policies and put forth in legislation and practice. And I'll let Ryan, I know that was a little over a minute, but very loaded question.
No, I think just affirming a lot of that and noting that while there is untold disaster awaiting in the future because of potential, irreversible tipping points in our climate system that will change water patterns and air quality patterns and migration patterns. This is also, deeply a now issue and has been a forever issue in the development of the United States of America. Which is built on a fundamentally and structurally racist, classist, and sexist economic and political system. So a lot of this stuff is not new. We are now faced with the physics of our world, limiting our ability for social movements to make the kinds of changes that we need to make. But the struggles that inform our fight for climate change are the struggles that informed the resistance to, the settling of this nation.
Thank you both so much. So I think, for our viewers, everyone who tuned in tonight, I think one big takeaway is that this legislation has something for everybody, whether you are a climate activist, if you are here for social justice, if you were here for women's rights, for immigrant rights, if you do anti-poverty work, this has something for everybody. And that's really important, because that means we can build out a broader coalition. So we need everybody to get involved, and we need you to put pressure on your electeds to ask them to support the CCIA so we can pass that right here in New York. We're going to pause for a moment. I'm going to share my screen here with you all. We're going to do some actions. Give me 1 second. Thank you, everyone. Here we go. I know we have Assemblywoman Gina Solitti in the house tonight. I want to thank her for this morning signing on as a pre-signatory to the CCIA. So thank you, Gina, for doing that. There are 2 other Assembly members. That's it, guys, 2. So that means our work is cut out for us. We need to start making a lot of calls. Sadly, none of the Long Island senators have signed on to support the CCIA yet. And I hope what you took away from tonight is that it's a no-brainer. If you believe in reducing inequality, if you believe in prevailing wage jobs, if you believe in combating our climate crisis, this is what it's all about. This is really everything that any community member would want. So what are our actions, our to-do lists? Wherever you're hailing from tonight, we're going to ask you to call your state senator. We're going to ask you to call your state assembly person too. If it's Gina, you can call her office and say thank you. Also, we're going to put these links in the chat. We'd love for you, if you liked what you heard tonight, please think about joining Transition Town Port Washington if you're local. Join the Long Island Progressive Coalition, which is where Ryan is from and does incredible, incredible work. They are really the, Ryan, you could speak to this, but you're the Long Island arm of New York Renews, really leading the fight. And we're very, very fortunate to have someone like Ryan at the helm. And so you can plug into New York Renews that way, or you can sign up directly with them. As we mentioned earlier, Nassau County now has a newly formed Sunrise movement. We do a lot of work together, so you're welcome to join us as well. And then we're going to ask you to sign up for the next event that Margaret Galbraith, who's also on this call, will be hosting and putting together our entire series. So I'm going to leave this up for a moment. Here are all of our Long Island state senators and their contact numbers. I'm going to ask you to give them a call. You can write it down. You can call this evening if you're feeling shy, if you've never called a state senator's office before. Their staffs are very, very friendly. You can call them and ask them to please support the CCIA. And here's a little tip if you're a first timer. You can call at night and leave a message. You don't even have to talk to anybody, but it is important that you make your voice heard and that you share with them that you want them to support this CCIA. And Ryan, do you want to just do a quick plug for the toolkit before we open it up to Q&A?
Yeah, I just put it in the chat. If you type in your address, it'll populate with the information for your assembly member and your senator and give you a script. And Geo, correct me if I'm wrong, does it just give you the number or does it help you patch through?
It should help you patch through. I'm going to click it right now. The way that we've done it before, it does everything for you, so it's seamlessly for you. So I'm clicking it right now just to confirm.
And there was a state Senate hearing on the bill this week, and we also have a one-click tool if you want to submit testimony in support. And that literally just takes 1 second. But calls are more effective. They get inundated with emails, so they don't really pay attention to them, but they pay attention to calls. And if offices get more than like 5 to 10 calls about a particular issue, it usually, like staffers who pick them up, it pings them to tell their boss that enough constituents are calling about a certain issue.
Yeah, and I just checked the link. It does patch you right through.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so we're going to open it up for Q&A now. So what I'm going to ask you to do, if you have a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand in the chat. Or in the, yeah. Okay, I have a question that someone sent to me directly that I can read while you all are thinking hard of your questions. I think this is probably a question suited to Ryan, but Geo, you can feel free to chime in as well. The question is, the Thrive Agenda calls for strengthening tribal sovereignty and enforcing Indian treaty rights. Thrive includes the codification of free, prior, and informed consent so that Indigenous people can determine the outcome of all decision-making that affects them. Can you talk about the relationship between the CLCPA and tribal sovereignty? Is it the same as the Thrive Agenda, or are there some differences?
Yeah, so this prompt is good for self-reflection because the CLCPA does not. It does not inform, it does not do the same kind of mechanisms for the nation-to-nation type relationships that Thrive does. A lot of my work, as I began as an organizer on Long Island, was to build relationships with the different nations on Long Island, which requires to show up without any agenda. It's to listen and to learn and figure out what their struggles are and issues are, which is just a good approach for most relationships or communities of people that you want to build relationships with, is to first listen and learn and understand what problems are before being like, I have the solution. That tracks with a lot of historical ideology that informs this country. So one of the things that has been emerging, because it's complicated, right? Like, these are sovereign nations. These are entire nations of people that, some early on were engaged around this bill, and they were like, that has nothing to do with us. That has everything to do with New York State. We have nothing to do with New York State, which is so fair. So a lot of our coalition members, like Long Island Progressive Coalition, Catskill Mountain Keeper in the Catskills, obviously, and Push Buffalo have like regional relationships where they've done a kind of solidarity and support work. But as a whole, the coalition has not really done a great job at this. And so our policies are not reflective of those nation-to-nation particularities. That's changing. We are in dialogue with members of the Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force, which is representative. It's a representative body of the 6 traditional longhouse governments of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which are Cayuga, Oneida, Onondaga, Tuscarora, Mohawk, and Seneca. And so we're in dialogue with them now. They realize that, wow, this has a lot of vast implications. We should figure out how to orient ourselves around this and do it in a way that like respects our sovereignty. And New York State is one of the most, as a government, one of the most egregious violators of indigenous sovereignty. The Department of Transportation and the Attorney General's office, Tish James, is suing the Shinnecock Nation on an ongoing basis. They have a lawsuit against them for economic development on their own land. Governor Cuomo's refused to acknowledge it. AG's office has refused to acknowledge it. And it's pretty horrific. And they have failed in their duty as a state to engage in this nation-to-nation consultation with those nations around this climate bill, which they are obliged to do because of the implications it has for land use, for the energy grid, and they have not done it. And so we're trying to be supportive of those calls to engage in that nation-to-nation relationship, specifically around the Climate Justice Working Group, which is defining the definition of disadvantaged communities. And we want them to be able to consider broken treaties as a qualifier for that. And ensure that equitable funding goes to these communities so that they can determine on their own right what they want to do. But it's an open invitation for, I think, all people doing environmental and climate work to ask themselves how they're relating to these nations. So there's been a little bit more conversations and dialogue around definitions in CCIA as it relates. And again, in my own relationships, there are folks from the Shinnecock Nation that are deeply supportive of this effort, and where we're talking about implementation programs, and we're talking about what to do with this funding and how to set themselves up for this stuff. But I would say writ large, it's an invitation for reflection for the coalition, and for other people to, even the most progressive social justice oriented entities can still preference the priorities of settlers, of non-Indigenous people. And that's an important lesson for all of us.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I can't believe that we don't have any questions. Is that really true? Does anyone have any comments? I know this was a lot of information. This was a very heavy topic tonight. I suspect some folks were digesting some of this for the first time. So if if anyone has any questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Oh, Paul Markelson, I'm going to call on you. Where are you? Can you unmute Paul, or do I have to unmute you?
Paul's a former LIPC board member. This is a plant.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I think you had to unmute me. I never have freedom to talk.
It's all about power.
Listen, hey, thank you, Gio, Ryan, Melanie. This is really great. A lot of really good and important information. So, you can see by the turnout from our electeds that we've got, their attention, and I think we've got good support. And, big shout out to Gina, because she's new, but she's showing leadership already. And that's really what we're looking for. We're pushing for leadership. But at the community level, in our community, how do we turn out more people to get them engaged and for them to, become participants, become leaders in the struggle? I think that building the base, to me, is not only important to support the CCIA, but also to build the base for, the continued fight. So what do you recommend? What should we do? What tips and techniques can you pass on to us?
Is that a question specific to a particular individual?
Gio and I have already private messaged that I'll start this one.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a really great question and important question, Paul. And I want to start it by kind of naming what I named before, right? Of like, there's already organized communities of people, whether in your community, whether it's a church, a synagogue, a temple, a Girl Scout troop, a theater group, whatever it is, like start showing up to other people's spaces. I think a lot of times we're often asking ourselves, how do we bring people to us? It's like, how do you go to where people already are? Farmers markets, other ideas. So part of that too is like, not going in with any particular intention or agenda, but just going to listen, learn, and build relationships. And that can be slow, that can be frustrating, that can be complicated. But they're all also, that if maybe that seems somewhat passive, you can also be super proactive by doing door-to-door canvassing campaigns that are not tied to just talking about who to vote for on a certain day. There's a technique called deep canvassing where you can go and you're literally just there to learn and listen about what people are experiencing and engage in longer conversations. And there's actual techniques there where you can actually move people on your issues by just being really affirming and understanding where people are coming from. There's a really incredible video of this. It's like a 20-minute conversation can like sped up to like 10 minutes where someone who is actively against this trans like rights bill, after that conversation comes away signing a petition in support of that bill. And because like a lot of people just want to be listened to and affirmed and heard and understood. And so there are ways that you could just like, you could structure, okay, let's go to this neighborhood with 5 people and make sure that we're hitting X amount of doors, and then have like a community event, like a potluck that you're bringing people to afterwards to just like talk about some of those issues. So, every community is different. Different communities are more or less walkable, more or less welcoming. There may be an infrastructure for community participation and civic engagement or not. But I think a diversity of, showing up to where people are and doing proactive things like, door knocking or phone banking for the intent of building community can go a long way. And Geo has an incredible amount of experience around this, so I will.
Thank you, Ryan. I definitely echo that. And what I hear in that too is stories, right? Like organizing around stories. That's the way that I was organized. I was organized through one-on-ones. At first, I was asked really risky questions that I had never divulged the responses to with anybody, even if my friends or family, because I lived a lot in my trauma and my experiences that created hurt and pain within me, right? And so organizing through our own stories and those of others for both like healing and transformation, our individual healing and transformation and that of others, that deeply resonates and creates that level of community and collaboration that unites people and builds a sense of solidarity that we're told is not possible, but that we've witnessed maybe in other relationships and other movements. They're just like, wow, like how do you create that truly intersectional movement of people of different backgrounds, right? And that's around stories. And so a really big emphasis on those one-on-ones and being able to have non-conventional conversations and really getting to the deep roots of who people are and how they've come to be that way, to both even understand how and why they think that way, even for climate deniers. Because there's a reason why they think that way. People aren't just born saying like, I don't believe in climate, right? And so getting to the deep root of that, I think also like it's a really big emphasis on our own families and friends. They say that the toughest folks to organize are those within our closest spheres and atmospheres, because they're the ones that know the most about us, but also often are the ones that can like trigger us and hurt us the most. And so that's also important for us to bring them into this space, because not only do we love them, but also like they're the ones that have instilled what we've learned within us, right? Like we all have an uncle or an aunt that is a climate denier, that is a pro-Trump person, that is like all these different things, right? And so we don't just want to throw those people out as mad as they can get us sometimes. We want to bring them along into this process. I said myself, I was a person that didn't believe in politics because of the level of education and quality education that I didn't receive. And so being able to commit to that is really important. And echoing once again what Ryan said, so that level of like self-transformation and healing, both on an individual level and collective level and on a planet level, is how we organize more and more folks. And that's how I got organized. That's how I organize other people. It's about our stories, and the stories that we're collectively putting forth and creating because if we're not individually telling our stories from a place of authenticity, that means that somebody else is telling our story. And the fact of the matter is, it won't be our genuine story because we are the experts in our stories. We were the ones that experienced it. And that leaves space for fossil fuel corporations to tell our stories for us. And that just can't continue to happen.
Thank you. I just want to add quickly to that. I mean, I think Gio and Ryan did a fantastic job talking about, the whole picture. But oftentimes too, it's meeting people where they're at in the process, right? Sometimes when we get in our spaces, we sort of create these bubbles and we go with like-minded folks. And we have to remember that we once started at the beginning too, right? So we can't expect everybody to have full understanding of an issue. Gio spoke so bravely earlier about not having the educational experience to understand that politics meant power and how she could access her own power that way. I think that is true for most people, even folks that are highly educated. It doesn't mean that they know all the ins and outs of a particular bill or of a particular issue. So I think, having that respect and meeting folks where they're at and educating them can really pull them in, and remembering to go outside our own bubbles and invite them along, for the movement. So I think that's important. I think Hildur has a quick question.
Yes, thanks for an incredible evening. I'm going to be replaying this. In terms of how to support the Shinnecock Nation, I think the polarity, it's striking that so close to home to us here. I've been following the fight to protect sacred burial grounds where development was planned. And I wanted to see where they stand with that and how we can support them, because in order to bring balance, it's really how to support our neighbors. If we look at the polarity, the real estate values next to them are, just outrageous on a global scale. And it's interesting to me if there's anything anything formulated in terms of restoration and repair, in terms of value of land and what was taken, or protection of their land.
Yeah, I know they are trying to extend a moratorium that they got passed on developments in the area. I don't know what the latest status of that is. I can follow up with folks. I think there was an upcoming meeting, because they are trying to also, at the same time as protect land, they're also working to set up like a land acquisition fund to directly purchase lands, to take it out of the real estate market and protect it in their own right. So I have to check in with my friend Tila there around where things stand with how public facing some of that is, because I think they might be waiting on closing some sales before going too big about the endeavor. But there's some upcoming town board meetings around closings of some of those properties. So again, it's moving forward. And then there's the legal battle still with the lawsuit that requires some of us to get our heads back around it together. If folks were following, we helped organize, following the leadership of the Warriors of the Sunrise, which is a women-led grassroots group from the nation. We organized Sovereignty Camp in November of 2020, which was a month-long occupation of their Aboriginal land right next to the development of what at the time was not their second monument, which is now constructed, which generated a lot of attention and media buzz and direct action and calls and emails and letters to the governor, and it didn't budge him. And so there's, I think, and they're still going on in the legal proceedings and going through the legal channels, and we definitely helped shake things up there, but it's just massively complicated, right? Like we're talking about the Hamptons, we're talking about literally the who's who of the 1% and the billionaire class and the puppeteers of our political system who don't want us acknowledge the sovereignty of these people, don't want to have them have their own economic development. This is about marijuana, this is about casino rights. This is about land values. This is about historical restitution. And the governor and his class buddies are not going to easily give up a fight in one of the most like richest places in the world. Like the Hamptons are a battleground for the ills of this country. And it's playing out with the complete lack of response by Governor Cuomo around this lawsuit. So I'm sorry if that's not satisfying or concrete, but it's also, this is a legacy of problems, and there's been some interventions, and it's an uphill battle.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I don't think we have any more questions in the chat, and I'm looking at the time, and I want to be very respectful for those of you that were so generous with your time here tonight. I just want to do a very special thank you again to Ryan and Geo, not only for being here tonight, but for the amazing work that you do every day, and for pushing us all to be better and to show up and be more involved. So thank you so much for that. I would also like to do a special shout out to all the electeds who hung tight with us and are still on the call. I see Maria Delamonte, our town councilwoman, Assemblywoman Solidi. I see Wayne Wink and Veronica Lurvy. I don't want to miss anybody. Let me just do a quick scan. I see Janet and Erin, Janet from Anna Kaplan's office, Erin from Mary Ann's office. I hope I didn't miss anybody. I don't think so. Thank you all for coming. This is obviously critically important legislation, and we hope that you'll all join us in pushing for it, whether or not you can vote for it. As elected leaders and representatives of our community, you have power and you have influence. So we're going to ask you to use it, and please be vocal about it. Be vocal on social media, show up to our rallies, give a call to your state senator, your assemblywoman, and say, please support this. It's really important for our community. And as Ryan said earlier, just because this is happening at the state level, it doesn't mean as a town, you can't look for initiatives to accelerate it and be the model, right? One of my favorite, most cliched phrases ever is be the change you wish to see in the world, right? And so we have an opportunity to do that. So I'm going to ask you all to please, fight for us, fight for the future of our children, because it's really that important. And I just wanted, Viviana Russell, I am so sorry I missed you. She's amazing, and she's running for town clerk. So I'm going to give you a little extra love. I don't know where you are. Oh, there you are. I'm so sorry I missed you. I apologize, Viviana. Thank you so much for being here as well. So thanks everyone. Please feel free to email Ryan or Geo. We put some links in the chat. We'll also be sending out a follow-up. Please do get involved, and don't miss our next climate series with the Landmark on April 29th, which will be moderated by our very own Margaret Galbraith, which we're very excited about. Thank you all very much, and you can have a wonderful night.